My name is Dr. Emily Carter. I'm 29 years old, and I am the chief emergency physician at Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago. Which means that on any given shift, I make life and death decisions about complete strangers with the specific, trained calm of someone who has learned that hesitation in an emergency department is the most expensive luxury available. I say that because I want you to understand who I am before I tell you who my family decided I was. In the emergency department, I am the person everyone calls when the situation is beyond ordinary management. I read the vitals, I assess the presentation, I order the interventions, and I make the call, clearly, correctly, without the luxury of extended deliberation, because the patient on the gurney does not have time for my uncertainty. In my family, I was the bad luck child. Those two things existed simultaneously for 29 years, and the distance between them is the story I am about to tell you. It was raining. On the evening they came to my door, not the gentle, cinematic rain of a scene designed to communicate melancholy. The actual, aggressive Chicago rain of a November evening, the kind that comes sideways and finds the gap between your collar and your neck, regardless of what you are wearing. I was in the kitchen when the security panel on the wall beside the refrigerator chimed, the specific two-tone chime of the front gate camera, activating, which it does when someone approaches the intercom. Daniel was in his home office. I could hear him on a call, the low, measured cadence of a man discussing logistics contracts with the specific, unshowy authority of someone who has earned the right to speak that way. Through 8 years of building something from nothing, I looked at the security panel. The camera feed showed 4 people standing at the gate in the rain. I recognized all of them. My father, Richard, 60 years old, in a coat I had not seen before. Not his good coat, the one he wore to the occasions he considered worth dressing for. A different coat, older. The coat of a man whose wardrobe has contracted. My mother, Diane, 56, standing slightly behind him with the specific, compressed posture of a woman who has spent her life managing other people's impressions and is currently failing at managing her own. My sister, Sophia, 32, who had not looked at me directly since the wedding. Jason's wedding, her wedding, the wedding that had happened 9 years ago, after my parents spent 6 weeks carefully dismantling the relationship I had built with a man I had loved. And Jason Mitchell, 31, who stood at the back of the group, with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the wet gravel of the driveway, not looking at the camera, not looking at anything in particular, with the specific, interior quality of someone who has been looking at the floor of a lot of rooms lately. I stood in my kitchen and looked at the security panel for approximately 45 seconds. Then I went to get Daniel. I need to go back 9 years. Not because the story requires a long preamble. It does not. The story is simple enough in its structure, which is part of what makes it so specific and so recognizable to anyone who has lived inside a family system, organized around a hierarchy they did not choose. I go back 9 years because the evening at the gate does not make sense without the evening. 9 years earlier, when I understood, with the cold, clarifying precision of someone receiving a diagnosis they had suspected but not confirmed, exactly what my family thought of me. I was 20 years old, the year my father's business collapsed. I was also, by what my parents considered a significant coincidence, born the same year the business was founded. 20 years of growth, followed by the specific, catastrophic failure of a company that had over-leveraged itself in a real estate market that did not cooperate with its projections. A story that was not unusual in that year, and that was not my fault, in any causal sense that a reasonable person could establish. My parents were not, in this context, reasonable people. They were people who needed an explanation for what had happened to them, and who found, in the coincidence of timing, an explanation that was emotionally satisfying, in the specific way that irrational explanations are emotionally satisfying. It assigned agency to something concrete. It located the cause in a single, identifiable source, and it relieved them of the responsibility of examining the actual decisions that had produced the actual outcome. I was the concrete thing. I was the identifiable source. My father never said it directly. He did not sit me down and explain that he held me responsible for the collapse of his business. He communicated it, the the way that families communicate the things they do not say directly, through the architecture of attention and resources, and the specific, consistent pattern of whose needs were urgent and whose were not. Sophia's school fees were paid without discussion. My scholarship applications were reviewed with the particular, distracted energy of someone completing a formality. They do not expect to produce results. Sophia's career milestones were celebrated at family dinners, with the specific warm enthusiasm of parents who considered her success a reflection of their own wisdom. My medical school acceptance was acknowledged with a nod and a comment from my father about the cost of the program. I paid for medical school myself. Loans, scholarships, and the specific grinding financial discipline of someone who has understood since the age of 20 that she is building her life with the resources she generates, rather than the resources her family provides. By 29, I had paid off my loans, completed my residency, accepted the position at Northwestern Memorial, and moved into a house in a neighborhood that my mother described, at the one family dinner I had attended in the previous 2 years, as very nice for someone starting out. I had not been starting out for several years, but the family's understanding of me had not updated to reflect the actual data. If you have ever been the person in your family whose achievements were consistently filed under the category of pleasant surprises rather than expected outcomes, drop a comment, because that specific experience produces a particular kind of exhaustion that is different from ordinary tiredness. It is the exhaustion of someone who has been disproving a thesis for so long that the disproving itself has become the primary relationship with the people who hold the thesis. Jason Mitchell came into my life in my 3rd year of residency. I want to be precise about how I felt about him, because the easy version of this story would have me describe him as someone I was naive about or blinded by, and I do not think that is accurate. I was not naive. I was a 3rd-year emergency medicine resident with the specific sleep-deprived clarity of someone whose professional environment does not leave much room for self-deception. I saw Jason Mitchell accurately. His charm, his ambition, his genuine intelligence about the technology sector he operated in, and also his materialism, his sensitivity to status, and the specific way he assessed rooms by the quality of people in them before he assessed them by anything else. I saw all of that. I chose him anyway, because the qualities I loved were real, and the qualities I was cautious about seemed, in the context of a relationship with someone who was not his professional environment, manageable. I was wrong about the manageable part, but the person who made them unmanageable was not Jason. I introduced him to my family at a Sunday dinner in March. I had been deliberate about the timing. March was after the worst of the winter, when my parents' moods tended to be slightly less compressed by the specific, seasonal weight of a Chicago winter. I had chosen a Sundays, because Sunday dinners had always been the family event where my father was most relaxed, where the formal performance of the family's self-presentation was slightly softer than it was at events that required dressing up. I had prepared in the way that I prepared for presentations in the emergency department, by anticipating the likely variables and thinking through the responses. What I had not anticipated was Sophia. Not specifically. I had anticipated that Sophia would find Jason interesting, because Sophia found wealthy, successful men interesting with the reliable consistency of a professional orientation rather than a personal one. What I had not anticipated was the specific speed and focus of her interest, the way she moved through that Sunday dinner, with the precise targeted attention of someone who has identified an objective and is executing toward it. She sat beside him. She asked him questions about his company, with the specific, intelligent attention of someone who has researched the subject before the conversation. She laughed at things, he said, with a specific timing of someone who understands that laughter, deployed correctly, is a form of attention that most people find irresistible. And she looked at me, twice, across the table. The look of a woman who has decided that the thing in front of her is more important than the relationship with the person it belongs to, and who has already factored the cost of that decision into her calculation and found it acceptable. I drove home from that Sunday dinner with the specific, uncomfortable knowledge that I had introduced something into a room that was not going to come back out the way I had brought it in. I was right. The 6 weeks that followed were the 6 weeks my parents spent dismantling my relationship with Jason Mitchell. I know the outline of what they did, because Jason told me years later in a conversation I will describe in the appropriate chapter. I know the specific content of some of it and the general shape of all of it, and I want to be fair about my parents in the way that the situation warrants fairness. They were not creative in their methods. They used the specific, ordinary tools of a family that wants a particular outcome and is willing to construct the narrative required to produce it. They told Jason I was unstable, the specific, clinical-sounding word that carries more weight when said about a doctor, because the implication that someone who works in mental health-adjacent environments might have personal struggles with the same territory is a suggestion that requires no evidence to land. They told Jason I wanted his money, a claim that required them to ignore the fact that I was a physician in the final stages of a residency that would result in a salary considerably higher than his at the time. But that worked because it confirmed a suspicion that wealthy people are susceptible to about people who enter their lives during periods of financial asymmetry. They told Jason I was jealous of Sophia, which was, in the specific, ironic way of things that contain a grain of something true, while being fundamentally false, the closest thing to an accurate statement in the collection. I was not jealous of Sophia. I was tired of the family system that organized itself around her. Those are different things, and the difference matters. But the difference requires a careful explanation that my parents did not provide, and that Jason, receiving the information through the specific channel of two people he had met at a Sunday dinner and who had charmed him with the specific, practiced warmth of parents performing approval, did not think to request. He broke up with me in a phone call. A phone call, after 8 months, the specific, cowardly medium of someone who has decided that the conversation does not require the respect of a face. He said, "I think we want different things." I said, "What things?" He said, "I've been talking to your family. I think they know you better than I realized." I did not say what I wanted to say. I said, "Okay, Jason." I put the phone down. I went back to work. 3 months later, he married Sophia. I found out from a cousin who sent me a photograph from the wedding. A large wedding, the specific, performed extravagance of an event designed to communicate status rather than celebrate a relationship. Sophia in a dress that photographed well, Jason in a suit that communicated exactly the right things about his tax bracket, my parents in the front row. I looked at that photograph for approximately 30 seconds. Then I filed it in the specific, interior location, where I stored things that had been confirmed rather than things that were still in question. The question had been, did my family value me? The photograph was the answer. I filed it. I went back to work. Daniel Brooks came into my life 3 months after Jason's wedding, through the specific, graceless mechanism of an arranged meeting that my mother orchestrated with the particular, guilty energy of someone who understands. They have done something that requires compensation and is attempting to provide it in the currency available to them. She called me on a Saturday morning and said, without the preamble that the situation might have warranted, "There is someone we would like you to meet. His name is Daniel Brooks. He is Richard's colleague's nephew. He is reliable." The pause before reliable told me everything about how Daniel had been described to my mother, and how my mother had processed that description. I said, "How old is he?" she said. 33. I said. "What does he do?" she said. "He works in retail sales. He is steady." Steady, the second word that communicated a category. The category of men who are not going anywhere in particular but will not cause problems on the way. I said, "Okay, Mom." Not because I wanted to meet Daniel Brooks. Because I was 29 years old, and I had spent the previous 3 months working 70-hour weeks in a residency program that left no time for the ordinary mechanisms of meeting people, and because the energy required to resist my mother's arrangements was energy I did not have available in sufficient quantity, and because some part of me, the part that reads situations accurately rather than the part that manages them emotionally, had calculated that the cost of agreeing was lower than the cost of the sustained campaign of resistance that disagreement would produce. I met Daniel Brooks on a Sunday afternoon at a restaurant my mother had selected. He was already there when I arrived, seated at the table, not on his phone, looking at the menu with the focused attention of someone who reads menus, rather than performing the reading of them. He stood when I approached. He was not what I would call conventionally striking, but he had the specific, quiet physical presence of someone who occupies their own body with comfort, rather than self-consciousness. He said, "Dr. Carter, I've been looking forward to meeting you. Not you look beautiful," the reflexive, performative opener of a man who has decided that the date requires a compliment as an entry point. Something direct and specific and slightly formal that communicated that he had thought about this meeting before arriving at it. I said, "Just Emily is fine," he said. "Emily, I should tell you up front. I know this is arranged. I know that probably isn't ideal. I thought it was better to acknowledge that than to pretend we happened to end up at the same table." I looked at him across the menu. I said, "That's a reasonable approach," he said. "I've been told I'm steady." Something in his expression, not quite amusement, more the dry, controlled acknowledgement of someone who knows exactly how they have been described and has decided to address it directly, rather than pretend the description wasn't made. I said, "I've been told you work in retail sales," he said. "I do." No elaboration, no defensive explanation, no pivot to something that would make the answer sound better than it sounded. Just, "I do, I picked up my menu." If you have ever sat across from someone who was described to you as a consolation prize and understood, within the first 10 minutes of meeting them, that the person doing the describing did not know what they were looking at, drop a comment. Because that is a specific experience, and I think it happens more often than the people it happens to discuss it publicly. We were married 7 months later. Not because I had fallen in love with Daniel Brooks in 7 months. I had not in the specific, overwhelming way that the word is sometimes used. I had come to trust him, which is a different thing, and which I have come to believe, after 9 years, is a more durable foundation. I had come to understand that he was precisely what he appeared to be. A man of specific, genuine intelligence operating in a professional context that did not reflect the full scope of that intelligence, with the specific, unhurried patience of someone who has decided where he is going and is not in a rush to explain the route to people who are not going with him. He told me, on the evening before our wedding, sitting in the small apartment he had lived in for 4 years with the specific, organized simplicity of a man who spends his money on things that compound rather than things that impress. "They judged me by my paycheck. You judged me by my character. That's why we're going to win." I did not know, at the time, exactly what winning meant in his calculation. I was beginning to understand that it meant more than I had been told to expect. 9 years later, I stood in my kitchen and looked at the security panel, and then went to get Daniel from his home office. He came out with his phone still in his hand. The call concluded. The specific, unhurried movement of a man transitioning from one thing to the next without drama. He looked at the security panel. He looked at the 4 people standing in the rain at the gate. He said, I said, "Yes." He said, "What do you want to do?" I looked at the camera feed. My father in his older coat, my mother with her compressed posture, Sophia not meeting the camera, Jason looking at the gravel. I said, "I want to go to the door." He said, "Okay." He put his hand briefly on my shoulder. We walked to the front door together. The first apartment Daniel and I shared smelled like fresh paint and old radiator heat, and the specific, slightly metallic smell of a building that has been standing since the 1970s and has absorbed 4 decades of other people's lives into its walls. It was not a large apartment. 2 bedrooms. One that we slept in, and one that Daniel used as an office, which I understood from the first week of our marriage was not a guest room and had never been intended as one. A kitchen with a window that faced the building's interior courtyard, which received approximately 40 minutes of direct sunlight per day in the summer, and less than that in every other season. A living room with the specific, functional arrangement of furniture belonging to someone who uses rooms for their intended purposes, rather than for the impression they make. Daniel's desk in the office was always covered in papers, not the disorganized papers of someone who has not found a system. The specific, dense coverage of someone who has found a system and is operating it at full capacity. Spreadsheets. Industry reports printed from logistics trade publications. Legal pads covered in calculations I could read the general shape of, but not the specific content. Because the content was in the operational language of a sector I had not studied. I asked him once, in the 3rd month of our marriage, what he was working on. He said, a business. I said, what kind? He said, logistics, transportation, moving things from where they are to where they need to be. He paused. It sounds simple, it's not simple. The complexity is in the systems, the routing, the timing, the cost structure, the relationships with the carriers. Getting all of those variables to produce a margin is the work. I said, how long have you been working on it? He said, 4 years, I said, before we met. He said, before we met. I looked at the desk, at the papers, at the legal pads covered in calculations. I said, is there anything I can do? He said, keep doing what you're doing. That's enough. What I was doing was working 60-hour weeks as a newly minted attending physician at Northwestern Memorial, building a clinical reputation in an emergency department that was one of the highest volume trauma centers in the city, and learning, in the specific daily way of a doctor, in her first years of independent practice, the difference between knowing medicine and practicing it. Daniel was doing something that looked, from the outside, like retail sales. From the inside, it looked like something else entirely. If you have ever watched someone work in a way that other people could not see, because the work was happening below the surface of what was observable, drop a comment, because there is a specific invisible quality to certain kinds of building. The building that happens in a spare bedroom at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. The building that does not announce itself. Because announcing it would require explaining it to people who would not understand it, and whose understanding is not required for the building to continue. Daniel was building something for 4 years before I met him, and continued building it for 3 years after we married, and told me, in the 3rd year of our marriage, that he was ready to register the company. He said, Brooks Logistics LLC, I'm filing the paperwork this week. I was eating breakfast, 7 a.m. between a night shift and a day shift, the specific, compressed meal of a physician who has learned to eat efficiently because the alternative is not eating. I said, what do you need? He said, a signature. You're listed as a co-founder. I looked at him across the kitchen table. I said, I haven't done the work, Daniel, he said. You created the environment where the work was possible. That counts, I said. That's generous, he said. It's accurate. I signed the paperwork. Brooks Logistics LLC began operations with 1 delivery truck, 2 contracted drivers, and a routing software system that Daniel had spent 18 months building from a combination of open-source tools and custom code. He had learned to write through a series of online courses he completed between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m. for 2 years. The truck was a used box truck, white. 2009. It had 140,000 miles on it when Daniel bought it, and it smelled, when you opened the cargo doors, of the specific mixed smell of every category of goods it had carried across its previous life. Daniel drove it himself for the first 6 months, not because he could not afford a driver. He had contracted 2. But because he wanted to understand the route, the timing, the specific, operational reality of what he was building from the inside, rather than from a spreadsheet. He wanted to know what the drivers knew. He wanted to understand where the system broke down, and where it held, and where the margin was being lost to variables he had not anticipated. He came home from those early shifts with the specific, physical tiredness of someone who has been doing manual work for long hours, and with the specific interior energy of someone whose understanding of their own system is deepening in ways that will compound over time. I made dinner on those nights. Not because our household had a formal division of labor that assigned cooking to me. It did not. We had arrived at an arrangement through the practical negotiation of 2 people with demanding schedules and a shared interest in both eating well and not resenting each other for the logistics of eating well. I made dinner on the nights Daniel drove because it was the thing I could do. That was useful, and because I had learned, in the first year of our marriage, that Daniel's version of being supported was not being asked how he was feeling, but coming home to a kitchen where food was being prepared by someone who understood what he was doing and believed it would work. I believed it would work. Not because I had reviewed the business plan in the specific analytical way. I reviewed clinical data. It was not my domain, and Daniel had not asked me to. But because I had spent a year watching the man work, and the way a person works tells you more about the quality of their thinking than the content of their plans. He worked with the specific, methodical attention of someone who does not confuse activity with progress. He did not make noise about what he was doing. He simply did it consistently, at the level of quality the work required, without the performance of effort that people who are less certain about their direction sometimes produce. He was certain about his direction. I trusted his certainty. Meanwhile, and I use that word intentionally, because what was happening in my family, while Daniel and I were building our life together, was unfolding in the specific, parallel way of things that develop independently and do not intersect until they intersect completely. Jason Mitchell's company was growing. I knew this the way I knew most things about Jason and Sophia in the years after the wedding, through the ambient information of a world where successful people in the same city occupy overlapping social and professional contexts, where news travels through mutual acquaintances with the particular, efficient speed of information that people find interesting. Jason's tech company had received a Series B round of funding. Jason's company had been featured in a regional business publication. Jason and Sophia had purchased a home in Lincoln Park, the specific, prestigious neighborhood that functions in Chicago as a signal of having arrived at a particular level of success and wanting that level to be legible from the street. My parents attended the housewarming. I know because my mother called me afterward, not to tell me about the event, but for a reason she had decided was unrelated to the event, and mentioned it in the specific, slightly careful way of someone who has decided that the information is not sensitive, but is also not entirely sure of that assessment. She said, "Sophia's new home is beautiful. You should see the kitchen," I said. "I'm sure it is." She said, "Jason has done very well," I said. "I'm glad to hear it," she said. "You sound tired," I said. "I worked a 14-hour shift yesterday," she said. "You should take better care of yourself." I put the phone down after that call and sat for a moment in the kitchen of our apartment. The kitchen with the 40 minutes of direct sunlight per day, and did not feel what my mother might have expected me to feel, which was inadequacy or regret, or the specific, comparative grief of someone measuring their life against someone else's housewarming party. I felt tired. And then I felt something else. The specific, clarifying recognition of someone who has just confirmed that the people observing her life are still observing it through the lens they have always used, and that the lens has not updated, and is not going to update based on any information she provides. I filed it. I went back to work. Year 4 of our marriage, Daniel hired his 12th employee. I remember the number because he told me at dinner with the specific, understated satisfaction of a man who tracks milestones, because they are meaningful rather than because they are performable. He said, 12 people, I said. How does it feel? He said, like the system is working. The system was working. Brooks Logistics had grown from 1 truck and 2 contracted drivers to a regional operation with 12 employees, a fleet of 6 vehicles, contracts with 3 mid-size regional distributors, and a revenue figure that Daniel shared with me, quarterly, with the same matter-of-fact specificity he brought to everything. The revenue figure in year 4 was not a number that required a housewarming party in Lincoln Park to be significant. It was, however, a number that would have surprised everyone who had been in the room at the Sunday dinner, where my mother introduced Daniel as someone's steady. I did not tell anyone, not because I was concealing it. I was not operating through concealment, which is a strategy I have never found useful, and Daniel had never suggested. But because the information belonged to Daniel, and to Brooks Logistics, and to the quarterly conversations we had at the kitchen table, not to the social ecosystem of the Carter family, or its assessment of what constituted success. The assessment of what constituted success was not my problem to manage. Year 6. Jason Mitchell's company ran into trouble. I learned this from a LinkedIn notification. The specific, ambient intelligence of a professional network that registers when someone you are connected to changes their employment status. Jason's title at his company changed. Then, it changed again. Then the company's page showed a funding status that told a story I recognized from the emergency department analog of companies that are treating symptoms rather than causes. I did not follow this closely, but I noted it, filed it, moved on. Year 7. Sophia called me for the first time in 4 years. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon. I was between patients. I looked at the name on my phone screen for a moment, and then answered because I am a physician, and I answer calls. She said, Emily. I said, Sophia. She said, I wanted to check in. See how you're doing. I said, I'm doing well, how are you? A pause that carried more information than a direct answer would have. She said, things have been a little complicated. With Jason's company. It's been a difficult year. I said, I'm sorry to hear that. She said, he made some investments that didn't. Some of the decisions weren't what I would have. She stopped. It's fine. We're managing. I said, that's good. She said, Daniel's doing well? I heard he started a company. I said, he did. She said, how's that going? I said, well, the specific one-word answer of someone who has decided that the full answer is not this conversation's business. Not from bitterness. I was not bitter about Sophia in the way that the easy version of this story might suggest. I was simply accurate about what this phone call was and what it was not. And what it was not was a genuine reconnection between two sisters. It was reconnaissance, I said. It was good to hear from you, Sophia. Take care of yourself. I put the phone down. I went back to my patients. Year 8. Brooks Logistics signed its first national contract. Daniel told me at dinner. Same matter-of-fact specificity. Same understated satisfaction. He said, Midwest Distribution Group. Nationwide routing contract. 3 years with renewal options. I said, that's significant. He said, yes. I said, how significant? He named a figure. I set down my fork. He said, that's the first year. It scales in year 2 based on volume. I said, Daniel. He said, I know. I said, that's you built that. He said, we built that. I said, I signed one piece of paper. He said, you believed me when no one else did. In year 1, in year 2, in year 3 when the margins were thin, and I was driving the truck myself and coming home, smelling like a cargo container. You made dinner, and you didn't ask me when it was going to work. You were there. I looked across the kitchen table at the man my mother had described as steady. She had not been wrong. She had simply not understood what steadiness, applied with intelligence and patience over 8 years, actually produced. Year 9. Jason Mitchell's company filed for bankruptcy protection. I read it in the business section of the Tribune. A 3-paragraph item, the specific, compressed notation of a business story that is significant to the people involved and peripheral to everyone else. Jason had the article noted, made a series of leveraged investments in a subsidiary venture that had not performed as projected. The company's primary creditors had initiated proceedings. The outcome for existing shareholders was uncertain. I read it once. I put the paper down. I thought about Jason saying, 9 years earlier on a phone call, I think we want different things. He had been right about that. What he had wanted was what my family had shown him, the specific, legible version of success that resided in a title and a funding round, and a house in Lincoln Park. What I had wanted was what I had, which was, by any measure that survived contact with time, considerably more than what he had ended up with. The evening they came to my door, Daniel and I had been living in our current home for 2 years. Not a mansion. I want to be accurate about this because accuracy matters more to me than impression. A house. A good house, in a good neighborhood, with a kitchen that received more than 40 minutes of sunlight. And a study where Daniel ran Brooks Logistics from a desk that was still covered in papers. Because some things do not change when they are working correctly. I had shown Daniel the security panel. He had looked at the 4 people in the rain. He had said, "What do you want to do?" I had said, "I want to go to the door." We walked to the front door together and I opened it. The rain was loud behind them. My father looked at me with the specific, compressed expression of a man who has rehearsed this moment and found, upon arriving at it, that the rehearsal did not fully prepare him for the actual experience. He said, "Emily." I said, "Dad." He said, we. Things have been difficult. Jason's company. I said, I know. He said, Richard invested. He stopped, tried again. We lost a significant amount. Your mother and I were in a position where he did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. I looked at my father, at my mother, at Sophia, who was looking at the porch railing, at Jason, who was still looking at the gravel. I said, come out of the rain. I said, come out of the rain. And they came in. That is the part of the evening I have thought about most in this month since. Not the conversation that followed. Not my father's admission. Not Jason, standing in my hallway with his eyes on the floor. The part I have thought about most is the moment I opened the door wider and stepped back and let them cross the threshold of a home they had not been invited to and had not visited before, and that existed, in every material and specific sense, as the direct product of choices they had dismissed as insufficient. I thought about it, because opening the door was a choice I made deliberately, and with full understanding of what it meant and what it did not mean. It did not mean forgiveness. It did not mean reconciliation. It meant that I was a physician, and physicians do not leave people standing in the rain because of the history between them. That is the discipline, and the discipline holds regardless of circumstance. The living room of our house has a specific quality in the evening, the warm amber light of lamps that Daniel had chosen with the same quiet attention he brought to everything. The specific, settled feeling of a room that has been lived in by people who were not performing their life for an audience, but actually living it. Books on shelves that had been read. A photograph on the side table of Daniel and me at the coast 2 years ago. The specific, unguarded photograph of two people who did not know they were being photographed, and were therefore exactly themselves. My father sat in one of the armchairs. My mother sat beside him on the edge of the sofa, with the specific, compressed posture of a woman who has not decided yet whether she is staying. Sophia sat at the far end of the sofa. She had not looked at me directly since walking through the door. Jason stood near the entrance to the room for a moment before Daniel said quietly, "You can sit," and gestured toward the remaining chair. Jason sat. Daniel sat beside me. The room was quiet for a moment, with the specific quality of quiet that exists when 6 people are in a space together, and all of them are aware of the weight of what is about to be said, and none of them are certain how to begin. My father began. He said, "Jason's company filed for bankruptcy in September." I said, "I know." He said, Richard and I had invested a significant amount. Your mother and I." He paused. "We had planned to use it for retirement. The investment was supposed to. Jason had projected." He stopped again. Jason, in the chair by the window, said, "I made bad decisions. I leveraged the company's assets into a subsidiary venture that I believed in, and that didn't perform. The projections were mine. The decisions were mine. Richard and Diane invested in good faith." He said this to the room, not specifically to me with the flat, exhausted specificity of someone who has said this sentence or versions of it many times recently, and has stopped expecting it to produce anything other than the acknowledgement it contains. I said, "How much?" My father said a number. It was a significant number. The specific, significant number of a retirement fund that had been redirected into an investment that had not survived contact with reality. I looked at my father. He was 60 years old, and he was wearing a coat I had not seen before. Not his good coat, which I remembered from the occasions he had considered worth dressing for across my childhood. A different coat, older. The coat of a man whose relationship to his wardrobe had been reorganized by circumstances. I said, "What do you need?" My mother said, before my father could answer, "We need to. We don't have anywhere." She stopped. Her composure, which had been the specific, maintained composure of a woman who has spent her life managing impressions, showed the first visible failure of its maintenance. "We've been staying with Richard's brother for 6 weeks. We can't. It's not a permanent." She stopped. I looked at my mother, 56 years old, sitting on the edge of my sofa, in a house she had not visited, with the specific, compressed expression of a woman who has arrived at a destination she spent 29 years ensuring she would never need to arrive at, and is finding the arrival more complicated than she expected. I said, "Okay, if you have ever been the person a family runs to after spending years running from you, not out of love, not out of belated recognition, but out of the specific practical urgency of having nowhere else to go. Drop a comment. Because that moment contains more simultaneously true and contradictory things than most moments. And the way you navigate it says more about who you are than anything you did in the years that preceded it. Daniel said, and his voice was the specific, even voice he used when he was being precise about something. I want to make sure I understand the situation. You've lost your retirement savings. You don't have stable housing. You've come here because, he paused. Why here, specifically? My father looked at him. I think it was the first time my father had looked at Daniel directly since walking through the door. He had looked at me. He had looked at the room. He had looked at the photograph on the side table with the specific, slightly delayed attention of a man who is seeing something that requires him to update his understanding of a situation, and is doing the updating in real time. He said, because Emily has always been. He stopped. He tried again. He said, because there was nowhere else, Daniel said. I appreciate the honesty. He said it without sarcasm, without the performed neutrality of someone suppressing a sharper response. He said it the way he said most things. Directly, with the specific, grounded quality of someone who has decided that accuracy is more useful than impression management in most situations. My father looked at him for a moment, then he said, You've done well. Daniel said, Yes, my father said. I didn't. When Diane introduced you as Emily's, I didn't think, Daniel said. No, you didn't. A pause, Daniel said. I don't need you to have thought so. It didn't change what I was going to do. Sophia spoke for the first time since sitting down. She said, Emily. I looked at my sister, 32 years old, the specific, slightly diminished version of the woman who had sat beside Jason at the Sunday dinner 9 years ago, with the focused, targeted energy of someone executing toward an objective. She still had the bone structure and the professional posture of a corporate PR executive. The career she had built, legitimately and through her own considerable capability, and that had not been destroyed by Jason's bankruptcy, because it was hers independently and existed separately from his financial trajectory. What had been destroyed, or damaged significantly, was the specific, status-organized version of her life that had been built around the marriage and the Lincoln Park house, and the ambient social positioning of being the wife of a successful tech entrepreneur. She said, I owe you an apology. I said, okay. She said, not just for Jason, for the way I treated you, for years, for being the person I was in that family and not. I had choices about who to be and I made the wrong ones consistently. I looked at my sister. I said, I know. She said, that's it, I know. I said, what else do you want me to say? She said, I don't know, something that tells me. I said, Sophia, I'm not angry at you. I haven't been angry at you for a long time. Anger requires me to care about your choices in a way that I stopped having the energy for around year 3. I paused. What I am is, I'm someone who built a life that does not require your apology to be complete. The apology is yours to make. It doesn't change my life either way. She looked at me. Something in her expression shifted. Not the compression of managed composure, not the calculation of a woman assessing a room, but something underneath both of those. The specific, raw recognition of someone who has just understood that the person they spent years treating as an afterthought has arrived at a position that does not include them. She said, You're not going to forgive me, I said. I'm not going to hold the anger. That's not the same thing as forgiveness. Forgiveness is something you earn through consistent action over time. We can talk about that later. Tonight I'm going to deal with what's in front of me. Jason said, Emily. I looked at him. He had been in the chair by the window since he sat down, and he had been, for the most part, silent, not the aggressive, defended silence of someone who has decided that silence is their strategy, but the specific, interior silence of someone who is in a room that is requiring him to confront things he has been managing the confrontation of for some time. He said, I need to tell you something. I said, okay. He said, your parents told me things about you. Before I ended things. You know that. I said, I know. He said, I believed them. I want you to know. I'm not going to tell you I didn't have a choice, because I did. I could have asked you directly. I could have told you what I was hearing, and given you the opportunity to respond. I didn't do that because, he paused, Because what they were telling me confirmed things I was already afraid of. I said, "What were you afraid of?" He said, "That you were too good for what I actually was. That you were going to figure that out before I was ready for you to figure it out." He looked at his hands. It was easier to believe them. It gave me a reason that wasn't about my own fear. The room was quiet. Daniel, beside me, had not moved. Jason said, "I chose Sophia because she wanted me, specifically, without qualification, in a way that didn't make me feel like I needed to be better than I was." He looked up. "That's not Sophia's fault. She was who she was. I made a choice based on what was comfortable rather than what was right," I said. "I know that too, Jason." He said, "Does it matter that I'm telling you?" I said, "It matters to you. That's the person it needs to matter to." My father said, "Emily." I looked at him. He had been quiet since Daniel's exchange with him. The quiet of a man who is processing something in the specific, slow way of someone who does not process quickly but processes thoroughly when he finally begins. He said, "I need to ask you something." I said, "Okay." He said, "Why did you hate me?" I looked at him. Something in my chest did the specific, involuntary thing that it does when a question arrives, that is so precisely wrong that correcting it requires going back further than the conversation has gone. I said, "I didn't hate you, Dad," he said. "You left. You built all of this." He gestured vaguely at the room. "Without us, without any of us. You went and built a life and you didn't." I said, "I didn't hate you. I gave up on being seen by you. Those are different things." He was quiet. I said, "You decided, when I was 20 years old, that I was the reason the business failed. You never said it directly. You communicated it in every way that families communicate things they don't say directly. And I spent 9 years waiting for you to update that assessment, and you didn't. And eventually I stopped waiting and built a life that didn't require the update." He said, "I know," I said. "Do you?" He said. "The day you were born, I lost everything." His voice was very quiet, and I spent 29 years blaming the wrong person. The room was completely still. Outside, the rain had not stopped. It moved against the windows with the specific, consistent pressure of a November storm that has settled in and is not in a hurry. I looked at my father, 60 years old, in his older coat, in a house he had never visited, saying the truest thing I had heard him say in 29 years. I said, "I know that too, Dad." He said, "I'm sorry, Emily." I said, "I know." I did not say, "It's okay," because it was not okay. It was a 29-year failure of a parent's fundamental responsibility toward a child, and the acknowledgement of that failure, while real and while meaningful, did not make the failure okay. Acknowledgement and absolution are not the same thing, and I had spent 9 years in an emergency department learning that diagnosing a condition correctly is not the same as having treated it in time to prevent the damage. The damage had been done. The acknowledgement was real. Both of those things were true simultaneously. I sat with both of them. Daniel said, at 9:47 p.m., "You should all eat something." He stood up and went to the kitchen. I heard him moving, the specific, domestic sounds of a man who has decided that the most useful thing he can do in the current moment is feed people, which is the same calculation I make at 3 a.m. in an emergency department, when the acute phase of a crisis has passed and the body's ordinary needs have reasserted themselves. I followed him. He was at the stove. I stood beside him. He said, quietly, "How are you?" I said, "I don't know yet." He said, "That's fair," I said. My father apologized. He said, "I heard." It doesn't fix anything." He said, "No, but it's real." I said, "Yes." He stirred something on the stove. I said, "What do we do?" He said, "Tonight we feed them. Tomorrow we figure out what help we can provide that doesn't cost us more than we're willing to spend. We set the terms clearly. We hold the terms consistently," I said. "And if they don't," he said, "then we hold the terms consistently." I looked at him. He looked back at me with the specific, steady quality that my mother had described as a limitation, and that I had come to understand, over 9 years, was the most valuable thing in the room in any situation that required someone to remain accurate under pressure. I said, "Okay." He said, "Okay." He put food on plates. I carried them to the people in my living room. I carried plates to the people in my living room at 10:04 p.m. on a rainy November evening and set them on the coffee table with the specific, practical efficiency of someone who has decided that the most useful thing she can do in the current moment is exactly what she is doing. Nobody said anything while I set the plates down. Not from awkwardness. Or not only from awkwardness. From the specific, exhausted quiet of 6 people who have been in a room together for an hour and have said the significant things and are now in the particular, suspended space that exists after significant things have been said and before anyone has determined what comes next. My father looked at the plate in front of him. He said, "Thank you, Emily." I said, "Of course." I sat back down beside Daniel. We ate. There is a specific, strange quality to sharing a meal with people who hurt you. Not the dramatic, loaded quality that the phrase implies when you describe it to someone who was not there. The actual quality is quieter and more complicated than that. The ordinary human business of eating, which does not pause for emotional complexity, and which creates, by its ordinariness, a kind of temporary truce with the circumstances that produced it. My mother ate carefully, with the specific, slightly self-conscious attention of a woman who is aware that she is a guest in a home she has never visited and is trying to behave accordingly. Sophia ate without looking up, which I recognized as her version of the same effort. The attempt to be present in a room without demanding anything from it. Jason ate because he was hungry. That was the specific, honest simplicity of it, and I found it, oddly, the most relatable thing about him in the evening, the basic, human fact of a person who has not eaten properly in some time and is now in front of food and is eating it. My father ate slowly. He kept looking at the photograph on the side table. Daniel and me at the coast, 2 years ago, the specific, unguarded photograph of 2 people who were exactly themselves. He looked at it 3 times during the meal. I did not comment on the looking. After the plates were cleared, Daniel cleared them, because Daniel clears plates, because that is who he is. I said, "I want to talk about what happens next. Practically." Everyone looked at me. I said, "I'm not going to tell you to leave. That's not who I am, and it's not the right thing to do. But I am going to be specific about what I can offer and what I cannot, because clarity is more useful than generosity that doesn't have defined limits." My mother said, "Emily," I said, "let me finish, Mom." She stopped. I said, "I can help with immediate housing while you find a stable situation. Not here. We don't have the space, and I don't think it would be good for any of us to try to live in close proximity right now. But I can cover 3 months of an apartment, at a reasonable level, while you reorganize. After 3 months, that's your responsibility." My father said, "That's more than..." I said, "I'm not finished." He stopped. I said, "I can connect you with a financial advisor. Someone competent. She will help you assess what you have, what you owe, and what a realistic path forward looks like. You go to every meeting. You follow the advice. I will not supplement income that is being mismanaged." I looked at Jason. I said, "I can give you a referral. A contact in the logistics sector who may have a position available at a level that is appropriate for where you are right now, not where you were 5 years ago. Whether you pursue it is your decision." Jason said, "Why?" I said, "Because I'm a physician, and we don't withhold available treatment based on personal history. You need a job. I have a contact. The connection is the right thing to do." He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "You're a different person than I expected to find here." I said, "I'm the same person I was 9 years ago. You just didn't know who that was. If you have ever been in a position to help people who hurt you and had to decide, not whether you could, but whether you should, and on what terms, and at what cost to yourself, drop a comment. Because that decision is the specific, adult version of the question that childhood sets up and that life eventually requires you to answer. Not what did they do to me? What kind of person am I going to be about it?" I looked at my father. I said, "I want to say something to you, not as a condition of the help, separately." He looked at me. I said, "You said tonight that you spent 29 years blaming the wrong person. I believe you mean that. I believe the acknowledgement is real." I paused. "I also need you to understand that the acknowledgement doesn't undo the years. It doesn't restore what those years cost me. The specific ways they shaped how I moved through the world, the things I had to learn without support, that children should be able to learn with it. The particular kind of loneliness of growing up in a family that has decided you are the source of its problems," he said. I know, I said. I'm not telling you this, so you feel worse. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand the actual scope of what happened. So that, going forward, if there is a going forward, it starts from an accurate place rather than a simplified one, he said. Is there a going forward? I looked at my father, 60 years old, in my living room, having said the truest thing I had ever heard him say, having arrived at my door through the specific, humbling mechanism of having no other options, which is not the ideal route to truth but is, sometimes, the only route available to people who have spent decades avoiding it. I said, I don't know yet. That depends on what you do with what you know now. It's not something I can decide tonight, and it's not something you can fix in a single conversation. If you want a relationship with me, it will be built slowly, on accurate terms, with the specific consistency of action over time that actually changes what a relationship is. I won't accept performance, he said. I understand, I said. Okay. Daniel drove them to a hotel, not a luxury hotel, a decent, clean hotel near the center of the city that was within the range of what I had offered and that communicated, in its specificity, the exact nature of what was being provided. Practical help, at a practical level, without the performance of more than what it was. Sophia and Jason were in separate rooms. I noted this without commenting on it, because the state of their marriage was not information I had requested and was not mine to manage. I sat in the living room after Daniel left and did not turn the television on, or pick up my phone, or do of the things that people do when they are trying to manage the specific, accumulated weight of an evening like the one I had just been through. I sat with it, the photograph on the side table. Daniel and me at the coast. Two people who were exactly themselves. The room that Daniel had furnished with the quiet attention of someone who was building a life rather than a performance of one. The specific settled quality of a home that had been earned rather than assumed. Daniel came back at 11:30. He sat beside me. He said, "How are you?" I said, "I think I'm okay. I'm not entirely sure," he said. "That's reasonable for 11:30 p.m. after that evening," I said. My father apologized. He said, "I know, I was there." I said, "It didn't fix it," he said. "No," I said, "but it was real." He said, "Yes." I said, "I don't know what to do with something that is real but insufficient," he said. "You hold both things. You don't resolve the contradiction because it isn't resolvable. You just hold it and keep moving." I looked at him. I said, "When did you get wise?" He said, "I've always been wise. You just married me before you had enough evidence to confirm it." Something in my chest did the specific thing it does when Daniel says, something that is simultaneously accurate and funny and kind, which is the particular combination of qualities I have never been able to fully account for in a single description. I said, "You were a retail salesman." He said, "I was a retail salesman with a plan." I said, "My mother called you steady." He said, "Your mother was not wrong. She just didn't understand what steady was worth." 3 months later, my parents were in an apartment on the north side. The financial advisor, Margaret Chen, who had been my patient 2 years ago, and who owed me nothing, but had agreed to take them on as clients, because she was good at her work and because the situation I described to her was the kind she was built for, had assessed their position, and constructed a path that was realistic rather than comfortable. My father was working, not at his own business. That was not the realistic path for a 60-year-old man, rebuilding from a significant financial loss. He was working in a management role at a construction firm, a position that had been available through a contact of Daniel's, and he was doing it with the specific, unshowy competence of a man who knows how to work, and is grateful to have work to do. My mother had taken a part-time position at a community center. She called me on the first Thursday of every month, not to ask for anything. The practical help had been provided, and its terms had been met, and that chapter was, for now, closed. She called because she had decided, apparently, that a monthly phone call was the beginning of the thing I had described as possible. A relationship built slowly, on accurate terms, with the consistency of action over time. The calls were short, 15 minutes. We talked about ordinary things, her work at the community center, my work at the hospital, the weather in November, the specific, small updates of two people who are learning, slowly and without either of them pretending it is easy, how to be in each other's lives in a way that neither of them has done before. I did not tell her she was forgiven. I also did not tell her she was not. I answered the phone on the first Thursday of every month. That was, for now, the accurate description of where we were. Sophia called in February. She said, "I've been offered a position in New York. PR director at a firm I actually respect." I said, "That's good, Sophia." She said, "I wanted to tell you before I left. In case." She paused. "In case you wanted to. I don't know. Say something." I said, "Good luck. I mean that," she said. "Is that all?" I said. "What else do you want?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to know if we're okay, you and me. If there's ever going to be a version of this where we're," I said. "I don't know yet." That's the honest answer. I'm not closing the door. I'm also not opening it all the way. We are wherever we are, which is two people who share a history and who are both apparently trying to be better versions of themselves than we have sometimes been. That's a starting point, she said. That's more than I expected. I said, "I know." She said, "Okay." She went to New York. Jason took the referral. The position was not glamorous. A mid-level operations role at a logistics firm, which had a specific ironic quality, given that my husband ran a logistics company, and the sector was one Jason had never operated in before. He took it without complaint, which told me something about where he had arrived in his understanding of himself and his situation. He called me once in March, he said. "I wanted to tell you, the position is good. I'm learning things I didn't know, I said. "That's often when the real learning happens," he said. "Emily," a pause. "For what it's worth," I said. "I know, Jason," he said. "Does it help knowing?" I said. "It helps you. That's who it needs to help," he said. "Right," a pause. "You and Daniel," I said. "We're good," he said. "I can tell." Another pause. "I chose wrong," I said. "You chose what you chose. The question is what you do next," he said. "Yeah." His voice had the specific, slightly lighter quality of someone who has put something down. "Yeah. Okay." He hung up. Daniel and I adopted 2 children in the spring, a girl, 4 years old, named Clara, who had her father's serious eyes and a laugh that arrived without warning, and filled whatever room she was in with the specific, total quality of a child's genuine delight. A boy, 6 years old, named Marcus, who had the focused, watchful attention of someone taking in more than he was showing, and who, in the first week he was home, spent 45 minutes sitting beside Daniel at his desk, watching him work before asking, with the specific, direct quality of a 6-year-old who has decided a question is worth asking. "What are you building?" Daniel said. "A company," Marcus said. "Can I help?" Daniel said. "When you're ready." Marcus said, "Okay," and went back to watching. I stood in the doorway of Daniel's office and watched my husband and my son, and felt the specific, complete quality of something that has arrived at its correct form. Not the performed happiness of a life that looks the way it is supposed to look, but the actual, specific, unglamorous happiness of a life that is exactly what it is, and that is enough. More than enough. Brooks Logistics expanded to a national operation in the fall. Daniel announced it at dinner. Same matter-of-fact specificity, same understated satisfaction. And Clara, who did not know what a national logistics operation was but understood from our expressions that it was significant, said, "Are we celebrating?" Daniel said, "Yes." Clara said, "Can we have ice cream?" Daniel said, "We can have ice cream." We had ice cream. Marcus ate his with the focused, methodical attention of a 6-year-old who takes ice cream seriously. Clara ate hers with the specific, joyful mess of a 4-year-old who has not yet developed a relationship with napkins. I looked at my family. The family I had built from the specific, unlikely materials of a Sunday dinner, where my parents introduced me to a retail salesman. They considered a consolation prize. And I thought about the 29 years that had preceded this kitchen and this ice cream and these children and this man. I thought about my father saying, "I spent 29 years blaming the wrong person." I thought about Daniel saying, 9 years ago, "They judged me by my paycheck. You judged me by my character. That's why we're going to win. We had won." Not in the specific, dramatic sense of a victory that required someone else's defeat. In the quieter, more durable sense of having built something real, on terms that were accurate, with a person who was exactly who he said he was. in a life that did not require anyone else's validation to be complete. Clara finished her ice cream and said, "Can I have more?" Daniel said. "One bowl." She said, "Please?" He said, "One bowl." She accepted this with the specific philosophical equanimity of a 4-year-old who has learned that some licits are negotiables and some are not, and that the correct response to the non-negotiable ones is graceful acceptance rather than escalation. I thought, she is going to be fine. I thought, they both are. I thought, we all are. The scholarship fund launched in November. 12 recipients. Medical students from backgrounds that did not include the specific, inherited advantages that medical education tends to reward. First-generation college students. Students who had worked their way through undergraduate programs. Students whose applications described the particular, grinding resourcefulness of people who have built their path rather than inherited it. I met with each of them individually. Not to give advice. I had not been asked for advice, and I did not offer it unprompted. To understand what they needed, and to make sure the fund provided it in a form that was actually useful, rather than in the form that looked best from the outside. One of them, a 23-year-old from the South Side named Priya, who had worked as a medical assistant for 2 years before starting medical school, and who had the specific, focused energy of someone who understands exactly what she is building toward, said to me at the end of our meeting. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Sure," she said. "Why this? Why medical students specifically?" I said, "Because I know what it costs to build something without support. And I know what a difference it makes when someone decides to provide that support without conditions." She looked at me. She said, "Someone did that for you," I said. "Several people, in different ways." She said, "I'm going to pay it forward," I said. "I know you will." She did not know that I knew this from the specific clinical evidence of having spent 20 minutes with her and having read, in the way I read patients and situations, and the gap between what is presented and what is actually happening. The particular quality of a person who does not accumulate things for herself, but processes them and passes them on. She was going to be extraordinary. I drove home from that meeting through a November city that looked the way Chicago looks in November. The specific, stripped-down clarity of a month that has removed the leaves and left the structure of things visible. And I thought about a rainy evening and a security panel and 4 people standing at a gate. I thought about opening the door. I thought about closing it. I thought about the specific accurate difference between those 2 actions and the specific accurate understanding of myself that had made one possible and the other, eventually, necessary. I pulled into the driveway. The lights in the house were on. Inside, Daniel was doing something in the kitchen. I could see him through the window, the specific, domestic silhouette of a man moving around a kitchen that smelled, from the driveway, of whatever he was cooking, which would be good, because it always was. Marcus was at the window of his bedroom, reading. Clara was not visible, which meant she was either asleep or engaged in something that did not require a window. I sat in the driveway for a moment, not from reluctance. From the specific, deliberate practice of taking a moment to understand what I am sitting in before I move forward into the next thing. A practice I had developed in the emergency department and that had migrated, over years, into the rest of my life. What I was sitting in was this: a driveway, in November, outside a house where my family was. The family I had built, from the specific, unlikely materials of everything my original family had not provided. I got out of the car. I went inside. Daniel said from the kitchen, "Dinner's in 20. I said, "Good." Clara appeared from somewhere and attached herself to my leg with the specific, total commitment of a 4-year-old who has decided that physical contact is the most efficient form of greeting. I picked her up. She said, "You're home," I said. "I'm home," she said. "Good." I carried her to the kitchen. I set her on the counter, where she could watch Daniel cook, which was her preferred location during dinner preparation, and which Daniel had never once objected to, because Daniel understood, without being told, that a child watching you cook is a child learning that making things for people is a form of love. I stood in my kitchen, in my house, in my life, and for the first time in 29 years, I was not performing anything for anyone. I was simply there, exactly where I was supposed to be.